Wealth is not built through effort alone. It is built through architecture. The wealthiest individuals in any society are not simply working harder than everyone else. They are operating inside a financial structure that most people cannot see, because no one teaches it, no textbook describes it clearly, and the institutions that benefit from public financial ignorance have little incentive to change that. There is a quiet rule that wealthy individuals follow when organizing their capital. It does not appear in standard financial advice. It is rarely discussed in mainstream media, yet it governs nearly every major wealth-building decision made by those who control serious capital, the kind of capital that compounds quietly across decades and generations, while the average person remains trapped inside a cycle of earning and spending that leaves them financially exhausted and structurally no better off than they were 10 years ago. This audiobook is not about motivation. It is not about changing your mindset with affirmations or rewiring your morning routine. What it is about is something far more consequential: the precise psychological and structural mechanics that separate the financial architecture of the wealthy from the financial behavior of everyone else. Most people treat money as something to be earned and spent. The wealthy treat money as something to be engineered. That single distinction carries consequences that compound over a lifetime. The gap between those two approaches is not a gap in income. It is a gap in understanding, and that gap widens silently, year after year, until the financial distance between the two groups becomes nearly impossible to close through labor alone. There is a reason why salary increases rarely produce lasting wealth. There is a reason why debt, used correctly, accelerates capital accumulation for some while destroying others financially. There is a reason why the wealthy consistently convert income into assets, while the middle class converts income into liabilities they mistake for assets. These are not accidents of circumstance. They are the predictable outcomes of two entirely different financial operating systems running simultaneously in the same economy. Later in this audiobook, you will encounter the precise mechanisms behind those systems. You will see how leverage functions, not as risk but as architecture. You will understand why compounding is far more violent in its consequences, both positive and negative, than most people recognize until it is far too late to correct course. You will see how generational wealth is not inherited so much as it is structurally designed, long before the next generation ever touches a dollar. The wealthy do not play a different game. They play the same game with a fundamentally different understanding of the rules. This audiobook will give you that understanding. Chapter 1. The Financial Operating System nobody installs. Nobody teaches a child how money actually works. Not in school, not in most households, not through any institution designed to serve the public interest. What children receive instead is something far more consequential than formal instruction. They receive observation. They watch how the adults around them respond to money, how they speak about it, how they behave when there is too little of it, and how they behave when there is briefly more. They absorb patterns, and those patterns, accumulated silently across years of childhood and adolescence, eventually calcify into something that functions exactly like software. A financial operating system running invisibly in the background of every decision an adult will ever make about money. The problem is not that this system exists. Every person operates through some form of internalized financial logic. The problem is that the system most people inherit was never designed to build wealth. It was designed, implicitly, to manage scarcity, to survive a paycheck, to handle an unexpected expense, to avoid the kind of visible financial failure that produces social embarrassment. It was not designed to accumulate capital. It was not designed to distinguish between assets and liabilities. It was not designed to think in compounding decades rather than monthly cycles. It was designed to consume, maintain, and repeat, and it runs continuously, without interruption, regardless of how much income flows into it. This is the reality that most financial advice refuses to address directly. The common prescription for financial struggle is more income. A raise, a side business, a better job. The assumption behind that prescription is that the problem is insufficient fuel. But the actual problem, in the vast majority of cases, is not the fuel. It is the engine. An operating system designed to convert income into consumption will do exactly that regardless of how much income it receives. Lifestyle expands. Spending categories multiply. Subscriptions accumulate. The upgraded home requires upgraded furnishings. The higher salary triggers a revised sense of what one deserves. Within 18 months of a significant income increase, the average household has restructured its spending to absorb the new income almost entirely, and the net wealth position has barely moved. This is not a failure of discipline. It is the predictable output of an unexamined financial operating system doing precisely what it was built to do. The wealthy understand this distinction in a way that most people never articulate explicitly, but that governs every major financial decision they make. They understand that wealth is not a function of income level. It is a function of what happens to income after it arrives. The question is never simply how much is coming in. The question is always what percentage of what comes in is being converted into productive assets rather than consumed, and at what rate that conversion is occurring. Those two variables, maintained consistently over time, determine financial outcomes with a reliability that approaches mathematical certainty. Consider two individuals with identical incomes. The first operates on the inherited consumption model. Income arrives, obligations are met, lifestyle is funded, and whatever remains, if anything, sits in a savings account earning minimal return. The second operates on a capital conversion model. Income arrives, a predetermined percentage is immediately redirected into assets before lifestyle spending begins, and financial decisions are evaluated not by how they feel in the present, but by what they produce over the next decade. Over a 20-year period, the financial distance between those two individuals will not be modest. It will be structural, and at a certain point, nearly unbridgeable through labor alone. The operating system determines the outcome, not the income. What makes this particularly difficult to address is that the consumption-based financial operating system is reinforced at every level of modern society. Advertising is engineered to trigger spending. Consumer credit is designed to accelerate it. Status systems are constructed around visible consumption rather than invisible capital accumulation. The person who drives an expensive vehicle and lives in a large home is socially legible as successful, regardless of whether they hold any actual net worth. The person who drives a modest vehicle, lives below their means, and quietly converts a significant fraction of their income into appreciating assets is financially invisible, which is, not coincidentally, precisely how the wealthiest individuals in any society prefer to operate. Changing this requires more than willpower and more than income. It requires a deliberate architectural decision, a conscious decision to examine the financial operating system currently running, identify the specific logic patterns that are producing consumption rather than capital, and replace them with a new set of structural rules that redirect the same income toward an entirely different outcome. That is not a motivational exercise. It is an engineering task. The chapters ahead will provide the components of that new architecture. But the first and most essential step is the one most people skip entirely. Acknowledging that the system currently running is not neutral, not inevitable, and not permanently installed. It was absorbed without consent. It can be replaced with intention. Every financial decision made from this point forward will be made inside one operating system or another. The only question worth asking seriously is which one is currently running, and whether it is producing the output that was intended. For most people, when they examine that question honestly for the first time, the answer is uncomfortable. That discomfort is the beginning of financial clarity. Chapter 2. Why the poor think in transactions and the rich think in systems. A transaction is a single event with a defined beginning and end. Money is exchanged. A result is produced. The event closes. What happens next is a separate transaction, unrelated, unconnected, governed by whatever circumstances present themselves at that future moment. Transactional financial thinking treats every financial decision as an isolated unit. It evaluates each decision on its immediate merit, its immediate cost, its immediate return. It is reactive by nature. It responds to what is present rather than designing what is coming. A system, by contrast, is a structure that produces results repeatedly and consistently, without requiring a new decision at each interval. A system does not respond to circumstances. It shapes them. It is not reactive. It is architectural. A well-designed system produces its intended output, whether the person managing it is paying close attention or not, because the logic of the system is encoded in its structure, rather than dependent on continuous conscious intervention. This distinction between transactional thinking and systems thinking is one of the most consequential and least discussed separators between those who build lasting wealth and those who do not. The transactional thinker evaluates a financial decision by asking what it costs and what it returns right now. Should the money go into savings or cover this month's shortfall? Should the bonus be deposited or applied to the credit card? Each decision is weighed in isolation, under the pressure of immediate circumstances, without reference to a larger structure. The logic is immediate and local. The outcome is a financial life that lurches from decision to decision, permanently reactive, perpetually managed, rather than permanently designed. The systems thinker evaluates a financial decision by asking a different question entirely. Where does this fit in the architecture? Not what does it return immediately, but what does it produce structurally over the next 10 years? Not what does it cost today, but what is the opportunity cost of not positioning this capital correctly? The decision is never evaluated in isolation. It is evaluated as a component of a larger machine. This shift in thinking framework is not primarily about intelligence or financial sophistication in the technical sense. It is about the unit of analysis. The transactional thinker's unit of analysis is the event. The systems thinker's unit of analysis is the structure, the set of rules, allocations, and mechanisms that will govern hundreds of future events simultaneously, without requiring a new decision at each one. Consider how the wealthiest individuals manage income. The money that arrives in their accounts does not sit awaiting a decision about how it should be deployed. The deployment decisions have already been made, architecturally in advance. A defined percentage flows automatically into investment vehicles. A defined percentage services strategic debt. A defined percentage funds operations, business or personal. A defined percentage is retained as reserve capital for opportunistic deployment. The system runs. The income flows through it the same way every cycle. No new decision is required at each arrival. The architecture handles it. The average person manages income in the opposite direction. Income arrives and then decisions are made about obligations, about wants, about what remains. The sequence is earn, then decide. And because decisions made under immediate pressure, with immediate context, and inside an inherited consumption operating system will consistently favor the present over the future, the outcome is predictable. The capital that could have been redirected into wealth-building structures is consumed instead, not through recklessness, but through the absence of a system that would have made a different decision automatically. There is a deeper psychological dimension to this distinction that is worth examining precisely. Transactional thinking is cognitively comfortable because it is local and immediate. The result of a transaction is visible, tangible, and proximate. The money was spent, the thing was acquired, the obligation was satisfied. The feedback loop closes quickly and completely. Systems thinking is cognitively demanding because it requires holding a long horizon structure in mind while making short horizoned decisions, which means accepting present discomfort in service of a future state that is not yet visible or tangible. The human brain is not naturally equipped to do this without deliberate structural support, which is precisely why the wealthy build their wealth architecture into formal systems rather than relying on willpower and good intentions at each decision. Point-to-parsum is one manifestation of this principle. When a percentage of income is automatically transferred into an investment account before the balance is available for spending, a system has been installed that removes the decision from the transaction. The transactional moment, the arrival of income, no longer triggers a decision about whether to invest. The investment has already been decided at the structural level. The transaction is governed by the system. This is a small example of a principle that the wealthy apply at every scale, from personal finance automation to corporate capital allocation to trust and estate architecture. The decision is made once, structurally, and then the structure executes the decision repeatedly without friction. The practical implication of this is significant, and it runs in both directions. A well-designed wealth system produces compounding results even during periods when the individual managing it is not paying close attention. During busy professional years, during personal difficulty, during periods of distraction, the system runs, capital accumulates, time does its work. Conversely, the absence of a system means that wealth building is entirely dependent on the quality of individual decisions made continuously across an entire lifetime. Decisions made under varying emotional states, under varying financial pressures, and inside the same inherited consumption operating system that has been running since childhood. The probability of consistently making optimal financial decisions under those conditions, across decades without a governing structure, is vanishingly small. Systems thinking is not a personality trait. It is a skill, and more precisely, it is a design task. The question is not whether a person is naturally inclined towards systems. The question is whether they are willing to sit down, examine their current financial architecture with honesty, identify where the system is producing the wrong output, and redesign the structure with the intended output in mind. The wealthy do this work. Most people do not. That single difference compounds across 30 years into an outcome most people attribute to luck, privilege, or some innate financial talent that others simply possess and they do not. It is none of those things. It is architecture. Chapter 3. The psychological traps, disguised as financial responsibility. The most dangerous financial mistakes are not the obvious ones. They are not the reckless gambles, the fraudulent schemes, the visibly irresponsible spending that any reasonable person would recognize as destructive. Those mistakes are harmful, but they are identifiable. They carry visible warning signs. The truly dangerous financial traps are the ones that arrive disguised as prudence. The behaviors society labels responsible. The choices financial culture rewards with social approval. The strategies that feel correct and yet quietly guarantee that genuine wealth accumulation will never occur. These traps are particularly difficult to escape, precisely because escaping them requires contradicting the financial consensus. The person who questions them is perceived as reckless. The person who follows them is perceived as sensible. And so the trap reinforces itself through social pressure, generation after generation, while the people inside it continue to feel virtuous about their financial mediocrity. The first and most pervasive of these traps is the mortgage as wealth-building strategy. Home ownership is presented in nearly every Western culture as the foundational act of financial responsibility, the primary mechanism through which ordinary people build wealth. Entire policy frameworks are constructed around incentivizing it. Social identity is organized around it. The person who owns a home is perceived as financially mature. The person who rents is perceived as financially adrift. This cultural consensus is so deeply embedded that questioning it feels radical. The financial reality is more complicated and, for most people, more uncomfortable. A primary residence is, by the precise definition that governs wealth architecture, a liability. It does not generate income. It generates expenses, mortgage interest, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and the opportunity cost of the capital locked inside it. It may appreciate in value over time, and in certain markets and over sufficiently long horizons, that appreciation can be meaningful. But appreciation in a primary residence is illiquid, inaccessible without borrowing against the asset or selling it, and in most markets barely outpaces inflation when the full cost of ownership is properly calculated. The wealth that ordinary homeowners believe they are building is largely a function of forced savings, the portion of each mortgage payment that reduces principal. That forced savings mechanism is real and not without value, but it is substantially less efficient than directing the same capital into diversified appreciating assets, and it comes attached to a structure that simultaneously consumes a significant fraction of household income in non-wealth building costs for decades. None of this means that home ownership is without value. It means that treating the purchase of a primary residence as a wealth-building strategy, as the wealth-building strategy, is a category error that delays or prevents the construction of actual capital-generating architecture. The wealthy buy homes. They do not mistake homes for their investment portfolio. The second trap is the emergency fund as financial strategy. Financial culture instructs people to maintain 3 to 6 months of expenses in a savings account as an emergency fund. This is not wrong as a risk management principle. Having liquid reserve capital is a component of financial stability. The trap lies in what happens after the emergency fund is established, which, in most households, is nothing. The emergency fund becomes the entirety of the financial strategy. Savings accumulate in low-yield accounts, protected from risk, generating returns that do not keep pace with inflation, while the opportunity to deploy capital into genuinely productive assets is perpetually deferred in favor of the psychological comfort of liquid savings. The wealthy maintain reserve capital as well, but they understand the distinction between reserve capital and investment capital. And they understand that capital sitting idle in a savings account is not merely earning a low return. It is losing purchasing power in real terms, while simultaneously failing to compound in any productive direction. Reserve capital has a defined purpose and a defined size. Beyond that size, capital that remains idle is not being responsible. It is being structurally inefficient. The third trap is debt avoidance as virtue. Society teaches that debt is dangerous, that carrying debt reflects poor financial management, and that the goal of responsible financial life is to eliminate debt as rapidly as possible. This framing is not incorrect as applied to consumer debt, the kind of debt incurred to fund consumption, which carries high interest rates and produces no asset in return. Consumer debt is genuinely destructive and should be eliminated with urgency. But the category of debt is far larger than consumer debt, and applying the same moral framework to all forms of debt produces catastrophic consequences for wealth building. Strategic debt, debt used to acquire income-producing assets, is one of the most powerful wealth-building mechanisms available. The wealthy borrow to purchase properties that generate rental income exceeding debt service. They borrow to fund business expansion that produces returns substantially higher than the cost of capital. They borrow against appreciating assets to redeploy capital without triggering taxable events. They use debt as leverage, as a tool that amplifies the productive capacity of their existing capital. Debt avoidance, applied universally, forecloses all of these mechanisms and ensures that wealth building is limited to the slow, friction-heavy process of accumulating capital from personal income alone. The fourth trap is income optimization as the primary financial focus. Career advancement, salary negotiation, professional development. These are not without value, but the cultural obsession with optimizing labor income as the primary financial strategy directs enormous quantities of human energy toward the least efficient form of capital generation available. Labor income is taxed at the highest rates in most jurisdictions. It is limited by the number of hours available. It stops entirely when the person stops working. It scales linearly at best. More hours, more output, more income, rather than exponentially. Capital income operates by entirely different rules. It compounds. It scales without proportional labor input. It is taxed at preferential rates in most jurisdictions. It continues, generating returns regardless of whether the person is actively working. And the gap between what labor income produces over a lifetime and what capital income produces over the same period, given the same initial commitment, is not modest. It is enormous. None of these traps are the result of bad intentions. They are the result of a financial culture that optimizes for risk avoidance and social approval, rather than for capital efficiency and long-term wealth architecture. The person following these patterns is doing what they were told. They are being responsible by the standards their culture gave them. They are also, by the standards of actual wealth architecture, quietly ensuring that real capital accumulation remains perpetually out of reach. Recognizing the trap is the prerequisite to designing the exit. Chapter 4. What the wealthy actually believe about money that others do not believe precedes behavior. Always. The financial decisions a person makes consistently across a lifetime are not primarily the product of their knowledge, their income, or their circumstances. They are the product of the specific beliefs they hold about what money is, what it does, what it is for, and what relationship they are entitled to have with it. Two people with identical financial knowledge and identical incomes will produce entirely different financial outcomes if their underlying belief architecture differs. The behavior follows the belief, the outcome follows the behavior, and the belief operates below the surface of conscious awareness, which is precisely why examining it requires deliberate effort. The wealthy hold a specific set of beliefs about money that are structurally different from the beliefs held by those who remain financially average. These are not motivational beliefs about deserving success or attracting abundance. They are precise, operational convictions about how capital functions, what risk actually means, how time interacts with money, and what the purpose of earning actually is. Examining them carefully reveals not a set of personality traits to admire, but a set of functional frameworks to understand and, where applicable, adopt. The first belief concerns the nature of risk. The average financial worldview treats risk as something to be minimized, ideally eliminated. Risk is associated with danger, with loss, with the kind of financial catastrophe that disrupts a stable life. The goal is to reach a financial position that is safe, predictable, and insulated from volatility. Security is the objective. Risk is the threat. The wealthy hold a fundamentally different belief about risk. They do not treat risk as danger to be avoided. They treat risk as a variable to be managed, calibrated, and strategically accepted in proportion to the expected return and within the boundaries of what can be survived. They understand at a structural level that the absence of risk does not produce safety. It produces stagnation. Capital that never accepts any risk earns returns that do not outpace inflation. Capital that accepts calibrated risk compounds over time at rates that transform financial position across decades. The risk is not the problem. Unexamined risk is the problem. Excessive risk relative to capital reserves is the problem. Risk itself, intelligently understood and strategically deployed, is the mechanism. The second belief concerns time. The average financial worldview treats time as a backdrop against which financial events occur. Things happen over time. Money is earned over time. Retirement is funded over time. Time is experienced as a neutral medium. The wealthy treat time as capital, a finite and non-renewable resource that either works for or against financial position, depending entirely on how capital is deployed within it. They understand that a dollar invested at 30 produces outcomes by 60, that a dollar invested at 40 cannot replicate, regardless of any other variable. They understand that the compounding mechanism is not linear but exponential, which means that the earlier years of an investment horizon are disproportionately valuable relative to the later years. Time is not a backdrop. It is the most powerful variable in the entire wealth-building equation, and it can never be recovered once spent. This belief about time produces behavioral differences that are visible in practice. The wealthy begin deploying capital early, even when amounts are small, because they understand that the compounding machine requires time above all other inputs. They do not wait until they feel financially comfortable to begin investing. They understand that waiting for comfort is structurally equivalent to surrendering the most valuable compounding years available to them. The third belief concerns the purpose of earning. The average financial worldview treats income as the end product, the thing to be maximized, protected, and gradually spent in the process of funding a life. Earning more is the goal. Spending what was earned is the expected outcome. Saving a portion is the responsible modification. The income is the primary event. The wealthy treat income as raw material. It is not the end product, it is the input. The purpose of earning is not to fund consumption. The purpose of earning is to acquire productive assets that will generate future income without requiring continued labor. Income is valuable not for what it can buy today, but for what it can be converted into, and what that conversion will produce across the next 2 decades. Every dollar of income is evaluated not by what it can purchase, but by what it represents as a deployment opportunity. This belief, held consistently, transforms income from a consumption resource into a capital-building instrument. The fourth belief concerns loss. The average financial worldview treats loss as a terminal event. A financial loss is a failure, evidence of a bad decision, a warning that risk should have been avoided, a signal to retreat from the circumstances that produced it. Loss is experienced as a verdict. The wealthy treat loss as data. A financial loss provides information about a specific deployment of capital in a specific set of market conditions. It does not represent a permanent verdict on the decision, the strategy, or the person. It represents a result that can be analyzed, adjusted for, and incorporated into the next iteration of the deployment strategy. Wealthy investors lose money. They lose money regularly. What distinguishes them is not an absence of loss. It is the relationship they hold with loss. They do not treat it as a reason to exit the arena. They treat it as the cost of playing a game that, played over a long horizon, produces outcomes that far exceed any individual loss within it. The fifth belief is perhaps the most structurally consequential of all, and it concerns the relationship between effort and return. The average financial worldview assumes a roughly linear relationship between effort and financial outcome. Work harder, earn more. Produce more, receive more. The labor is the primary mechanism, and the financial reward is proportional to the labor invested. The wealthy understand that this relationship, while real in certain narrow contexts, is not the architecture that produces serious capital. Serious capital is produced by systems that generate return independent of continuous personal labor, by assets that appreciate, by businesses that operate on leverage, by capital deployed into mechanisms that compound. The return-to-effort ratio in these mechanisms is non-linear. A well-positioned real estate portfolio does not require proportional additional effort to double in value. A compounding investment account does not require labor to generate returns. The wealthy build structures that produce non-linear return-to-effort ratios, and they do this deliberately and with the specific intention of separating their financial outcomes from the linear ceiling that labor alone imposes. These beliefs are not innate. They are not inherited through genetics or transmitted through wealth alone. They are frameworks, ways of understanding money that can be examined, tested, and adopted by anyone willing to engage with them seriously. But they cannot be adopted passively. They must be chosen, deliberately, in direct contradiction to the belief architecture that most people are currently running. That contradiction sustained consistently over time, is where financial transformation actually begins. Chapter 5. The Scarcity Algorithm. How fear of loss quietly destroys wealth. Loss aversion is one of the most robustly documented findings in behavioral economics. In the foundational research conducted by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky across several decades, the consistent finding was this: the psychological pain produced by losing a given amount of money is approximately twice as powerful as the psychological pleasure produced by gaining the equivalent amount. Losing $100 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining $100 feels good. This is not a personal weakness or a character flaw. It is a feature of human psychology, a deeply embedded cognitive architecture that evolved to protect against irreversible harm in environments where losses could be existential and gains were incremental. In the context of survival on an ancestral savanna, this asymmetry was highly adaptive. Avoiding a catastrophic loss was indeed more important than capturing an incremental gain. The asymmetry kept organisms alive. In the context of modern wealth building across a long-horizon investment environment, this same cognitive architecture functions as a precision mechanism for financial self-destruction. The problem is not that loss aversion exists. The problem is that it operates continuously and largely unconsciously, producing distortions in financial decision-making that feel, to the person experiencing them, indistinguishable from rational caution. The scarcity algorithm, as it manifests in financial behavior, does not announce itself as fear. It announces itself as prudence. It presents as wisdom. It argues persuasively that the conservative choice is the smart choice, that the risk being avoided is genuine, and that the capital being protected is being protected for good reason. And all of this happens while the compounding that was never started fails to accumulate. The assets that were never purchased continue to appreciate for someone else, and the financial position of the person operating inside the scarcity algorithm remains structurally unchanged year after year. The first and most common manifestation of the scarcity algorithm is the permanent deferral of investment. The market is uncertain right now. The economy is unstable. The political environment is unpredictable. Interest rates are at an inflection point. It would be wiser to wait until conditions are clearer. This internal argument is the scarcity algorithm in its most articulate form. It presents as sophisticated market awareness. It is, structurally, the fear of loss dressed in the language of analysis. The evidence is unambiguous on this point. Time in the market, across virtually every documented historical period of sufficient length, produces better outcomes than attempts to time the market. The investor who waits for certainty before entering a market never enters, because certainty never arrives. Uncertainty is not a temporary condition that precedes an optimal entry point. It is the permanent condition of markets. The fear of investing in uncertain conditions is simply the fear of investing, reframed as patience. Every year of deferral is a year of compounding that will never be recovered. At a 7% annualized return, a conservative estimate for a diversified equity portfolio over a long horizon, capital doubles approximately every 10 years. The person who defers investment by 10 years has not simply delayed their returns. They have surrendered the entire first doubling of their capital. The scarcity algorithm, operating through the logic of prudent caution, has produced a loss far greater than any market correction the person was trying to avoid. The second manifestation is premature liquidation. An investment is made. The market declines. The paper loss is painful, disproportionately more painful than the earlier gain was pleasurable. The scarcity algorithm activates. It argues that selling now prevents further loss, that the decline is likely to continue, that protecting what remains is the priority. The position is liquidated, the loss is crystallized, and then, as markets do across sufficiently long horizons, with overwhelming historical regularity, the recovery begins. The person who sold at the bottom has now done something. that is structurally and mathematically difficult to recover from. They have removed their capital from the compounding mechanism at precisely the moment when the compounding mechanism was about to produce its greatest value. This pattern is not rare, it is the statistical norm. Research on individual investor behavior consistently demonstrates that the average retail investor underperforms the funds they invest in because of precisely this behavior. Entering after gains have already occurred, and exiting after losses have already been recorded. The sequence is wrong in both directions. The scarcity algorithm drives both errors simultaneously because the pain of loss pushes toward liquidation at the worst possible time, and the relief of recovered confidence triggers re-entry at a less advantageous price. The third manifestation is the rejection of asymmetric opportunity. Genuine wealth-building opportunities are almost never symmetrically safe. They carry risk, usually visible, often significant, sometimes uncomfortable to hold. The opportunity to purchase real estate in a declining market, to invest in an early-stage business with structural advantages, to deploy capital into an undervalued asset class during a period of broad pessimism. These opportunities exist precisely because the majority of people operating inside the scarcity algorithm cannot bring themselves to accept the visible downside risk in order to capture the less visible, but structurally larger upside. The wealthy who have developed a different relationship with loss are able to evaluate asymmetric opportunities through a different lens. They ask not whether the loss is possible, it always is, but whether the structure of the opportunity is such that the probability-weighted upside substantially exceeds the probability-weighted downside, and whether their capital reserves are sufficient to survive the downside scenario if it occurs. This is not recklessness, it is the application of risk calibration in place of loss aversion. The scarcity algorithm does not distinguish between catastrophic and manageable loss. It responds to the prospect of any loss with an approximately uniform signal to retreat. This uniform response is profoundly destructive in an environment where the distinction between a catastrophic and a manageable loss is precisely the variable that should govern the decision. The fourth and deepest manifestation of the scarcity algorithm is the hoarding of money in the guise of saving. Savings accounts feel safe because the nominal balance does not decline. The number on the statement stays constant or increases slowly. There is no visible loss to trigger the pain response. The scarcity algorithm is satisfied, but in real terms, in purchasing power adjusted for inflation, money sitting in a low-yield savings account loses value continuously and silently. The loss is real. It is simply denominated in a currency the scarcity algorithm does not recognize as loss, because the nominal figure never decreases. This is one of the most consequential tricks the scarcity algorithm plays. It produces the illusion of financial safety by protecting against the kind of loss it was designed to recognize: sudden, visible, nominal loss, while enabling the slow, invisible, real loss of purchasing power across decades. The person protecting their savings from the apparent danger of investment is actually subjecting it to the certain danger of inflation erosion without any of the upside that the risk of investment would have provided. The exit from the scarcity algorithm is not achieved through willpower alone. It is achieved through structural redesign. When investment decisions are made once, architecturally, when the percentage of income redirected into productive assets is decided at the system level rather than the transaction level, the scarcity algorithm has fewer opportunities to intervene. The automatic transfer executes before the loss aversion response can activate a persuasive counter-argument. The investment occurs not because the person felt confident, but because the system they designed, when they were thinking clearly, continues to execute in the moments when they are not. The scarcity algorithm is not the enemy. It is simply a tool being applied in the wrong context. The task is not to eliminate it, but to understand precisely where it distorts decision-making, and to build financial architecture that functions correctly, even when the algorithm is insisting otherwise. That architecture begins with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of how powerful this mechanism is, how reliably it operates, and how invisibly it disguises itself as the voice of reason. In the world of wealth building, caution that produces inaction is not safety. It is the most expensive mistake most people never recognize they are making. Chapter 6. Why income is the least reliable path to wealth. There is a belief so deeply embedded in modern economic culture that questioning it feels almost transgressive. The belief is this: that financial security and eventual wealth are produced primarily by earning a good income, by securing a well-paying job, advancing through a career, negotiating raises, and accumulating a larger salary over time. Work hard, earn more, save what remains, retire on the balance. This is the operating narrative of middle-class financial life in virtually every developed economy. It is the framework parents transmit to children, that educational institutions reinforce, and that corporate career structures are designed to reward. It is also, as a wealth-building strategy, profoundly inefficient. And the inefficiency is not marginal, it is structural. The first and most fundamental problem with income as a primary wealth-building mechanism is taxation. Labor income is taxed at the highest rates available in virtually every modern tax jurisdiction. In most developed economies, a person earning a professional salary will surrender between 30 and 50% of their gross income to various forms of taxation before they have the opportunity to deploy a single dollar toward wealth building. The wealth building game begins for the labor income earner after the most significant friction in the entire financial system has already been applied. Capital income, income derived from investments, dividends, appreciation, and business ownership, is taxed at substantially lower rates in most of these same jurisdictions, in many cases at half the effective rate applied to labor income or less. This is not an accident. It is a policy architecture that reflects, with considerable precision, the political and economic priorities of the systems that designed it. Capital is encouraged. Labor income, beyond the amount required to fund consumption, is taxed in a way that substantially limits its conversion into further capital. The person relying exclusively on labor income to build wealth is operating against a structural headwind that the person deploying capital income does not face. The second problem is the ceiling. Labor income is bounded in a way that capital income is not. There are only 24 hours in a day, and even the most efficient professional can dedicate perhaps 12 of them to productive labor. Income generated through personal effort scales, at best linearly: more hours, more output, more compensation. But even this linear scaling is bounded by physical capacity, market rate for skills, and the organizational structures within which most professionals operate. The highest paid professionals in most fields, surgeons, attorneys, senior executives, earn impressive incomes. They do not, through labor income alone, build the kind of generational capital that the ownership class accumulates, because their income, however large, still stops when they stop working. It is fundamentally dependent on their continued personal participation. Capital income operates without this constraint. An income-producing asset generates returns, regardless of whether its owner is working, sleeping, or present in any form. A portfolio of dividend-paying equities distributes income on a schedule determined by the companies held, not by the hours the portfolio owner invests. A portfolio of rental properties generates monthly cash flow, irrespective of the owner's professional activity. A business structured around systems, rather than personal labor, produces revenue without requiring the owner's direct and continuous involvement. Capital income scales non-linearly. A larger capital base produces proportionally larger returns without requiring proportionally larger labor input, and it compounds. Returns reinvested generate their own returns, which generate further returns, in an exponential curve that labor income, no matter how large, cannot replicate. The third problem is fragility. Labor income, is a single point of failure. It depends on the continued health of the earner, the continued existence of the employer, the continued relevance of the skill set, and the continued economic conditions that support the industry in which the earner operates. Any one of these variables can be disrupted by illness, by corporate restructuring, by technological change, by economic contraction. When a person's primary or sole source of financial production is their own labor, the disruption of that labor, for any reason, is immediately a financial crisis. This fragility is not hypothetical. It is the lived experience of millions of people during every economic downturn, every industry disruption, and every health crisis that removes a primary earner from the workforce. The absence of capital-generating assets means that the disruption of labor income is not merely inconvenient. It is potentially catastrophic because there is no alternative income architecture to absorb the shock. The wealthy structure their financial lives to avoid this fragility specifically. They build multiple streams of capital income precisely so that the disruption of any single stream does not threaten the structural integrity of their financial position. This is not merely diversification as financial planning principle. It is the deliberate construction of financial resilience through the replacement of labor income dependency with capital income architecture. The fourth problem is time arbitrage. Every year spent optimizing labor income at the expense of capital deployment is a year in which compounding did not occur. The professional who spends their 30s maximizing salary, funding a lifestyle that consumes the majority of that salary, and deferring capital deployment until they feel financially ready, is not simply delaying their investment timeline. They are surrendering the compounding years that will never return. The years when the initial deployment of capital would have had the longest possible runway to grow, compound, and produce the exponential outcomes that make serious wealth possible. The wealthy begin deploying capital early, even when the amounts are small, because they understand that the variable of time is irreplaceable. A modest portfolio initiated at 25 will, in most historical market environments, substantially outperform a larger portfolio initiated at 45, simply because of the additional compounding years available to it. The person waiting to build capital until they earn enough is applying a labor income logic to a capital income problem, and the error cost them decades. None of this argues that income is irrelevant. Income is the raw material from which capital is initially derived. Without income, there is nothing to convert. The argument is not against earning, but against the misidentification of earning as the destination. Income is the starting point of the capital conversion process. It is valuable, not primarily for what it can fund in the present, but for what percentage of it can be redirected into capital-generating structures that will produce income independent of labor across the decades ahead. The question that distinguishes the wealth-building orientation from the income optimization orientation is deceptively simple. Of the income currently being earned, what fraction is being permanently converted into productive capital, into assets that will generate returns, without requiring further labor input? For most people, the honest answer to that question is a number that should produce urgency, because income earned and consumed leaves no permanent trace in a financial life. Capital, deployed and compounded, leaves one that grows for decades. Chapter 7. Assets, liabilities, and the accounting fraud most people live inside. There is a definition of the word asset that most people operate with, and there is a definition that actually governs wealth accumulation. They are not the same definition. The common definition is intuitive and feels correct. An asset is something valuable that you own. A house is an asset. A car is an asset. A degree is an asset. A pension is an asset. A piece of jewelry inherited from a grandparent is an asset. Under this definition, the typical middle-class household is quite asset-rich. It owns a home, 1 or 2 vehicles, several pieces of electronic equipment, a collection of furnishings, and perhaps a retirement account of some description. Net worth statements compiled under this framework often look reasonably healthy, which is precisely the problem. The definition that governs wealth accumulation is more precise and far less forgiving. An asset is something that puts money into your pocket. A liability is something that takes money out of your pocket. The distinction is not about ownership. It is not about value, replacement cost, or sentimental worth. It is about cash flow direction. The question is not what something is worth if sold today. The question is what it produces or costs on an ongoing basis. If it generates income, cash flow, dividends, rental income, appreciation that can be liquidated, it is an asset in the functional sense. If it requires ongoing expenditure, maintenance, insurance, interest payments, taxes, depreciation, it is a liability, regardless of what it is called on a balance sheet, applied to the actual possessions of a typical household. This definition produces results that are almost universally uncomfortable. The family home, as discussed earlier, requires ongoing mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs. It does not generate income. It is a liability. It may appreciate, and that appreciation may eventually be realized, but until it is, the home is consuming household cash flow month after month, decade after decade. The person living in it owns an increasingly valuable asset in the net worth sense, while simultaneously sustaining a cash flow drain in the functional sense. Wealth, properly understood, is not built by accumulating things that are worth more than they cost to purchase. It is built by accumulating things that generate more cash flow than they consume. The vehicles are unambiguous liabilities. They depreciate continuously from the moment of purchase, require ongoing insurance and maintenance costs, and generate no income whatsoever under any ordinary circumstances. They are consumption expenditures spread across a financing period, and the financing period adds an interest cost that increases the total consumption beyond the purchase price. A vehicle may be necessary. It is not an asset. The degree, despite the social consensus that education is an investment, is in most cases a liability that has been converted into a labor income generator. The degree itself does not produce income. The labor it enables produces income, and that income, as established, is the least efficient form of capital generation available. The debt incurred to obtain the degree is an unambiguous liability. Whether the income enabled by the credential justifies the debt incurred to acquire it is a question that depends entirely on specific circumstances, and, in a significant and growing number of cases, the honest answer is that it does not. The retirement account is the one item in most household inventories that comes closest to meeting the functional definition of an asset. It generates returns without requiring labor input. If it is invested in productive assets, equities, income-producing instruments, it compounds over time and generates future cash flow. But even here, most people mismanage the relationship between their retirement account and their financial life. They treat it as a locked container, capital that will become accessible at some future date and cannot be engaged with strategically in the present. The wealthy treat capital as capital, regardless of the account in which it sits, and deploy it within the constraints of whatever structure holds it toward the maximum productive use available. The significance of this definitional correction extends beyond accounting. It changes the entire framework for evaluating financial decisions. Under the common definition, acquiring more things of value is the wealth-building activity. The larger home, the newer vehicle, the upgraded electronics, the collection of possessions that signals material success. These feel like evidence of financial progress because they represent increased ownership of things society considers valuable. Under the functional definition, acquiring more things of value is often the primary mechanism of wealth destruction, because the things most people acquire as evidence of financial success are, functionally, liabilities. They consume cash flow rather than generate it. Every dollar directed toward a liability is a dollar that is not being directed toward an asset. And every dollar directed toward an asset is a dollar that will generate additional dollars indefinitely, without requiring further input. The compound effect of consistently directing capital toward assets rather than liabilities over a 20 or 30-year period is the primary mechanism behind virtually every significant private fortune ever built, outside of extraordinary luck or inheritance. This is also why the wealthy often appear to live below their apparent means, why they drive unremarkable vehicles, maintain modest primary residences relative to their net worth, and avoid the conspicuous consumption that characterizes the financially aspirational. They are not simply frugal. They understand the directional arithmetic of cash flow, and they have structured their financial lives to maximize the percentage of capital moving toward income-generating assets and minimize the percentage moving toward consumption. What looks like restraint is actually capital efficiency. The middle class, by contrast, has been sold a version of success that is almost perfectly engineered to produce the appearance of wealth while preventing the accumulation of it. The large home, the new vehicles, the private school tuitions, the luxury vacations financed on credit, each of these is presented as evidence that a person has succeeded financially. Each of them is, under the functional definition, a liability. Each of them is consuming cash flow that could otherwise be compounding toward genuine financial independence. This is not a moral judgment about consumption. People are entitled to spend their income on whatever produces meaning and satisfaction in their lives. The point is not that consumption is wrong. The point is that consumption masquerading as wealth building is a category error with consequences that compound over decades. Understanding the difference between what you own and what owns you, between what generates cash flow and what consumes it, is one of the most foundational and practically consequential pieces of financial knowledge available. Most people never receive it in this form. And so they continue building balance sheets that look healthy, living in houses they call assets, driving cars they call investments, and wondering, with genuine confusion, why their financial position never seems to meaningfully improve despite decades of earning, spending, and trying to be responsible. The accounting is wrong. Until the accounting is corrected, the architecture cannot be built. Chapter 8. The Architecture of Debt. How the wealthy borrow to build debt is the most morally loaded word in personal finance. It arrives carrying decades of cultural weight. The warnings of parents, the lessons of grandparents, who lived through economic catastrophe, the financial advice industry's consistent messaging that debt is a disease to be cured and an enemy to be defeated. This moral framework is not without some basis. Consumer debt, the kind incurred to fund consumption that produces no asset, at interest rates designed to maximize the lender's return, is genuinely destructive. High-interest credit card debt is a financial emergency. Personal loans taken to fund lifestyle spending are liabilities compounding in reverse. The advice to eliminate consumer debt aggressively and urgently is sound, but the moral framework applied to consumer debt has been applied universally to all debt, regardless of its structure, its purpose, or what it produces. And this universal application has placed one of the most powerful wealth-building mechanisms in the world beyond the reach of the very people who most need access to it. The wealthy do not avoid debt. They architect it. The distinction between debt that destroys wealth and debt that builds it is not complicated, but it is precise. The question is not whether debt is present. The question is what the debt is producing. Debt incurred to acquire an asset that generates income exceeding the cost of debt service is not a liability in the functional sense. It is a leverage mechanism. It amplifies the productive capacity of capital by allowing the deployment of resources beyond what personal savings alone would permit. And it does so in a way that, when structured correctly, produces returns that substantially exceed its cost. Consider the mechanics of a straightforward example. A property is available for acquisition at $500,000. A purchaser has $100,000 of available capital. They could wait for years, potentially decades, until they have accumulated $500,000 in personal savings, sufficient to purchase the property without debt. During that waiting period, the property appreciates. The rental income it would have generated is foregone, and the capital sitting in savings earns a return substantially below what the property would have produced. Alternatively, they deploy their $100,000 as a down payment, borrow the remaining $400,000 at an interest rate that represents the cost of debt capital, and acquire the property immediately. The property generates rental income. That income services the debt, covering mortgage payments and potentially producing positive cash flow beyond debt service. The property appreciates. The equity position grows both through appreciation and through the gradual reduction of the principal balance. The return on the initial $100,000 of deployed capital, calculated against the appreciation, cash flow, and equity accumulation produced by a $500,000 asset, substantially exceeds what the $100,000 would have generated sitting in a savings account, or even in a moderately performing investment portfolio. This is leverage. The debt did not consume wealth. It amplified the productive capacity of available capital by a factor of 5. The wealthy apply this mechanism across multiple asset classes and at multiple scales. Real estate is the most accessible example for most people, but the principle extends throughout the financial architecture of serious capital. Businesses borrow to fund expansion, acquiring productive capacity that generates revenues substantially exceeding the cost of the borrowed capital. Investors use margin, cautiously and within defined risk parameters, to amplify position sizes in appreciating assets. Private equity structures use leverage as the central mechanism of their return architecture, acquiring businesses with a combination of equity and debt, improving the operational and financial structure of those businesses, and generating returns on the equity component that would be impossible without the amplifying effect of the debt. None of this is magic. All of it is arithmetic. The arithmetic is straightforward. If the asset financed by debt generates a return higher than the cost of the debt, the difference between those two rates accrues to the equity holder. The larger the asset base financed by debt, the larger the absolute value of that difference. This is why wealthy individuals with significant capital consistently use debt as a tool rather than avoiding it. Because at the scale at which they operate, the arithmetic of leverage produces outcomes that are simply unavailable to those who restrict themselves to deploying only what they personally own. The risk in this architecture is real and must be acknowledged precisely. Leverage amplifies outcomes in both directions. An asset that appreciates produces amplified returns when purchased with debt. An asset that declines in value produces amplified losses. This is why the architecture of debt requires several conditions to function safely. The first condition is positive cash flow coverage. The income generated by the asset must service the debt without requiring capital contributions from other sources. A rental property must generate sufficient rental income to cover its mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance while leaving a margin of safety for vacancies and unexpected expenses. A business must generate sufficient operating income to service its debt while maintaining operational reserves. Leverage applied to assets that cannot generate sufficient cash flow to service their debt creates fragility. A temporary disruption in income triggers a capital crisis, and the leverage that was supposed to amplify returns instead accelerates financial distress. The second condition is reserve capital. Leveraged positions require the maintenance of capital reserves sufficient to survive a deterioration in asset performance, without forcing premature liquidation. The investor who deploys every available dollar into leveraged positions, maintaining no reserve, has created a structure with no shock absorption. Any adverse development, A vacancy period, a market decline, an operational disruption produces a liquidity crisis that may force asset sales at the worst possible prices. The wealthy maintain reserves specifically to allow leveraged positions to be held through adverse conditions, capturing the recovery rather than crystallizing the loss. The third condition is a return differential sufficient to justify the risk. Borrowing at 7% to invest in an asset likely to return 9% produces a 2% differential, modest, and potentially insufficient to justify the complexity and risk of the leverage. Borrowing at 5% to invest in an asset with a historical return of 11% produces a 6% differential. The arithmetic is more compelling, and the structural margin for adverse conditions is wider. The wealthy evaluate leverage not by the availability of debt, but by the differential between the cost of capital and the expected return. And they pursue leverage only when that differential is sufficiently wide to produce meaningful amplification of return while maintaining an acceptable risk profile. There is one additional dimension of debt architecture that the wealthy understand and deploy with considerable sophistication: the tax efficiency of borrowed capital. In most jurisdictions, interest paid on debt used to acquire income-producing assets is tax deductible. This means that the effective cost of debt capital is lower than the nominal interest rate by the amount of the tax benefit. A 7% interest rate for an investor in a 40% tax bracket with fully deductible interest has an effective cost of approximately 4.2%. The asset producing returns of 9% is generating a 4.8% differential against the after-tax cost of capital. A more attractive arithmetic than the nominal rates would suggest. Furthermore, the wealthy use a strategy sometimes referred to as borrowing against assets rather than liquidating them. When capital is needed for a new deployment opportunity, the wealthy often borrow against existing appreciating assets, using a home equity line, a portfolio margin facility, or a securities-backed loan, rather than selling those assets to generate capital. This approach preserves the compounding position in the existing asset, avoids the taxable event that a sale would trigger, and deploys fresh capital into the new opportunity, using debt as the funding mechanism. The existing asset continues to appreciate. The new opportunity is funded. No taxable gain has been realized. The debt has served as a bridge between two productive positions without disrupting either. This is debt architecture at a sophisticated level, a level that is structurally unavailable to those who have internalized debt avoidance as a financial principle, and structurally accessible to those who understand debt as a tool whose value lies entirely in how it is designed and deployed. The fear of debt is not irrational. It is a reasonable response to the version of debt that most people have direct experience with: consumer debt, credit card debt, personal loan debt. That version is genuinely destructive. The version of debt that builds serious wealth is constructed differently, deployed differently, and governed by an entirely different set of principles. Understanding the difference is not optional for anyone who intends to build capital at a meaningful scale. Chapter 9. Compounding. The most misunderstood force in personal finance. Albert Einstein allegedly called compound interest the eighth wonder of the world. Whether or not he said it, the sentiment understates the case. Compounding is not merely a financial mechanism. It is the closest thing to a physical law that economics produces. A process that operates with the reliability of mathematics and the patience of geology, producing outcomes that are consistently and dramatically underestimated by the human mind, until the point at which they become impossible to ignore. The reason compounding is consistently underestimated is not lack of exposure to the concept. Most financially literate adults have encountered compound interest calculations. The reason is neurological. The human brain processes quantity in approximately logarithmic terms. It is better equipped to perceive proportional differences than absolute ones. Exponential growth, which is what compounding produces, is neurologically counterintuitive. The mind expects linear progression and is surprised repeatedly by exponential outcomes. This neurological limitation has financial consequences that are among the most expensive in a person's financial life. Begin with the fundamental arithmetic. A single dollar invested at a 10% annual return, approximately the historical average annualized return of diversified global equity markets across long periods, becomes $1.10 after 1 year. Not remarkable. After 10 years, that dollar has become $2.59. After 20 years, 6.73 cents. After 30 years, $17.45. After 40 years, $45.26. After 50 years, $117.39. The progression is worth examining not just as numbers but as a pattern. The increase from year 1 to year 10 is an 49 cents. The increase from year 40 to year 50 is $72.13, more than 48 times larger from the same single dollar, simply because of the additional time the mechanism was allowed to run. The earlier years produce small absolute increases. The later years produce enormous ones. This is the mathematical reality of exponential growth. The power of compounding does not diminish with time, it accelerates. Every additional year is more valuable, in absolute terms, than the year that preceded it. Applied to real capital at real scale, this arithmetic becomes almost incomprehensible in its implications. $100,000 invested at 10% annually and left untouched for 40 years becomes approximately $4.5 million. The same $100,000 invested for 30 years becomes approximately $1.75 million. The difference between a 30-year and a 40-year horizon for the same initial capital at the same return rate is $2.75 million, produced by a single additional decade of the mechanism running. The decade was not funded by additional capital. It required no additional labor. It simply required the decision to allow the mechanism to continue operating rather than interrupting it. This arithmetic governs one of the most consequential decisions in personal finance: the decision of when to begin. Every year of delay before deploying capital into compounding structures is a year removed from the end of the compounding horizon. And because of the exponential nature of the mechanism, years removed from the end of the horizon are not equal. They are the most valuable years in the entire sequence. The person who delays the beginning of their investment program by 10 years does not simply lose the returns those 10 years would have produced directly. They lose the compounding effect of those returns across all subsequent years. They have removed the most powerful decade from the back of their compounding curve. The decade where the mechanism was producing its largest absolute gains. The urgency this should produce in any person who has not yet begun deploying capital into compounding structures is difficult to overstate. Compounding applies with equal force, and in the opposite direction, to debt. This is the dimension of compounding that financial education consistently underemphasizes, and the consequences of this underemphasis are visible in the financial lives of millions of people who have accumulated consumer debt without understanding the mechanism they have inadvertently activated. A credit card balance of $10,000 carried at an interest rate of 20% annually and serviced only with minimum payments does not simply cost 20% per year. It compounds. The unpaid interest is added to the principal. The new, larger principal generates a larger interest charge. The cycle accelerates. The balance grows not linearly but exponentially. And the mathematical reality is that the original $10,000 balance, serviced only with minimum payments at 20% interest, will take approximately 30 years to retire and will cost in total interest alone a sum that is a multiple of the original balance. The consumer borrowed $10,000. The compound mechanism will extract $40,000 or $50,000 before the debt is extinguished. This is not a predatory anomaly. It is the same mechanism that builds wealth in investments, running in reverse on debt. The wealthy understand this symmetry with a precision that makes them genuinely averse to carrying high-interest consumer debt. Not because of moral discomfort with borrowing, but because they understand that every dollar of compounding consumer debt they carry is the compounding mechanism, operating as a wealth destruction engine rather than a wealth creation one. There is a third dimension of compounding that extends beyond financial returns and into behavioral and cognitive domains, the compounding of knowledge, skills, and financial decision-making quality. Warren Buffett is often cited as the world's most successful investor. What is less commonly understood is that the overwhelming majority of his net worth was accumulated after his 50th birthday, not because his investment returns improved dramatically after 50, but because the capital base had compounded to a scale at which the same percentage returns produced enormous absolute gains. The mechanism had been running for decades. The exponential curve had reached the stage where each additional year produced gains larger than the accumulated gains of the earlier decades combined. This is the final and perhaps most important practical implication of compounding for anyone designing a financial life. The mechanism requires time above all other inputs. It cannot be accelerated by anxiety. It cannot be compressed by urgency. It runs at the pace that mathematics dictates. The only variable within human control is when it begins. The person who begins early maintains the discipline not to interrupt the mechanism during inevitable periods of market volatility, and allows the exponential curve to run its full length, will arrive at outcomes that bear almost no resemblance to what linear thinking about money would project. The person who begins late, or interrupts the mechanism repeatedly through premature liquidation, or never begins because conditions never felt quite right, will arrive at outcomes that are equally predictable and considerably less comfortable. Compounding does not care about intentions, about effort, or about the quality of the reasons given for delay. It cares only about time, and time, once spent, does not compound. Chapter 10. Leverage, the mechanism the wealthy use that most people fear. Leverage is a word that carries risk in its syllables. In public discourse about finance, leverage is most frequently encountered in the context of collapse. Over-leveraged institutions, leveraged buyouts that destroyed companies, individual investors who borrowed against their portfolios and were wiped out when markets moved against them. The word has accumulated a catalogue of catastrophic associations, and this catalogue has produced a widespread intuition that leverage is an advanced and dangerous instrument, best left to sophisticated institutional actors, and that the financially responsible individual should build wealth slowly, through personal savings alone, without the amplifying effects and amplifying risks that leverage introduces. This intuition is understandable. It is also, as a universal principle, one of the most expensive financial beliefs a person can hold. Leverage, precisely defined, is the use of borrowed capital to increase the potential return of an investment. It is a mechanism, not an ideology, not a personality, not inherently reckless or prudent. Like a scalpel, it produces outcomes entirely dependent on the knowledge and intention of the person deploying it. Used without understanding, it accelerates financial destruction. Used within a properly designed architecture, it is the single most powerful mechanism available for building wealth beyond what personal capital alone could produce. To understand why, it is necessary to understand the fundamental arithmetic of return on equity. When a person deploys their own capital entirely, purchasing an asset with no debt, their return is straightforward. If the asset appreciates by 10%, their return is 10%. If it generates cash flow of 5% on the purchase price, their yield is 5%. The return is directly proportional to the asset's performance. When leverage is introduced, when a portion of the purchase price is financed by debt, the arithmetic changes in a way that is not intuitively obvious until it is calculated directly. An investor purchases an asset for $1 million using $200,000 of personal capital. and $800,000 of borrowed capital at 5% interest. The asset appreciates by 10% in year 1, producing a gain of $100,000. The interest on the borrowed capital is $40,000. The net gain after debt service is $60,000. That $60,000 gain was produced on a personal capital deployment of $200,000, a 30% return on equity, achieved from an asset that itself returned only 10%. The leverage ratio of 5-to-1, total asset value relative to personal capital, amplified the underlying return by a factor of 3, after accounting for debt service costs. This is the arithmetic of leverage. It is not complicated, but its implications are profound. The wealthy deploy it across real estate portfolios, across business acquisitions, across investment structures of every description, because they understand that the differential between the cost of borrowed capital and the return generated by the asset it finances is the source of extraordinary wealth acceleration. And they have spent decades building the credit history, financial relationships, asset base, and structural knowledge required to access debt capital at rates that make this differential consistently positive and sufficiently wide to justify the structure. Leverage is not equally accessible to all participants in the financial system. This is one of its most significant characteristics, and one of the reasons it concentrates wealth effectively. The quality of leverage available, the interest rate, the terms, the volume accessible, is itself a function of existing wealth, credit history, and institutional relationships. The individual with a substantial asset base and an established credit profile can access debt capital at rates that would be unavailable to someone beginning their financial journey. The institution with billions under management can access leverage terms that individual investors cannot approach. This creates a self-reinforcing dynamic. Those who have already built capital can access leverage at favorable rates to build more capital, while those who most need the amplifying effect of leverage to catch up are either unable to access it or can access only its most expensive and poorly structured forms. Understanding this dynamic is not an argument for discouragement. It is an argument for building the conditions that make favorable leverage access possible. The credit profile, the initial capital base, the asset history, as early and as deliberately as possible. Every year spent building those conditions is a year closer to the threshold at which leverage becomes a structurally available tool rather than a hypothetical one. There are several distinct forms of leverage, and the wealthy deploy all of them, often simultaneously. Financial leverage, as described above, is the use of borrowed money to acquire assets. It is the most commonly discussed form. It operates through mortgages, business loans, margin facilities, and securities-backed lending. It amplifies returns when asset performance exceeds debt cost. Operational leverage is the use of fixed costs to amplify the impact of revenue growth. A business with high fixed costs and low variable costs experiences disproportionate profit growth as revenues increase beyond the fixed cost threshold. The infrastructure was built once. Additional revenue flows through it with minimal incremental cost. Each additional unit of revenue produces a larger profit margin than the one before it, because the fixed cost base is spread across a larger revenue base. Building operational leverage into a business structure is one of the primary mechanisms through which businesses scale profitably, and it is a concept that applies to any revenue-generating structure, not only to large corporations. Human leverage is the use of other people's time, skills, and effort to produce results beyond what personal labor could generate. This is the leverage embedded in any business that employs people. The business owner deploys capital and management to direct human resources toward productive output that exceeds the cost of those resources. For the individual building wealth outside of a traditional employment relationship, human leverage is one of the earliest and most accessible forms. Contracting, delegating, and building systems that multiply personal output without proportionally multiplying personal hours. Knowledge leverage is perhaps the least recognized but most consequential form available at the individual level. A piece of financial knowledge, the understanding of how a specific tax structure works, the mechanics of a specific investment vehicle, the regulatory framework governing a specific asset class, once acquired, can be applied across an unlimited number of transactions without diminishing. The initial investment in acquiring the knowledge is fixed. The return on that knowledge scales with every application. This is why the wealthy invest significantly in financial education, not as a motivational exercise, but as a leverage deployment. Each piece of structural knowledge acquired is a permanent capability that can be applied profitably indefinitely. Risk management is the discipline that makes leverage survivable, and it deserves particular attention. The failure cases of leverage, the ones that fill the cautionary catalog, almost universally share a common feature. The leverage was applied without sufficient attention to the downside scenario, without adequate capital reserves to survive adverse conditions, and without a structured exit or adjustment mechanism that could be activated before a temporary difficulty became a permanent loss. The wealthy do not use leverage recklessly because they can afford losses that ordinary investors cannot. They manage leverage conservatively because they understand that the purpose of leverage is to accelerate wealth building, and that a leveraged position that collapses under adverse conditions does not merely produce a loss. It eliminates the capital base that future compounding would have required. A loss of capital is not merely a setback proportional to its size. It is a compounding event running in reverse, eliminating not just the capital lost, but all future returns that capital would have generated. This is why position sizing, reserve capital, and cash flow coverage are non-negotiable components of any leverage architecture. Not because the wealthy are timid, but because they understand the mathematics of recovery. A 50% loss of capital requires a 100% gain, simply to return to the starting position. A 70% loss requires a gain of 230%. These recovery requirements are not merely inconvenient. At certain scales, they are structurally impossible within a reasonable time horizon. Leverage deployed with proper architecture and governed by disciplined risk management is the mechanism through which the distance between ordinary capital and serious wealth can be closed within a single generation. Leverage deployed without understanding is how that distance widens permanently. The difference between those two outcomes is not luck. It is knowledge, applied with discipline, within a structure that was designed before the deployment began.